Welcome to the second episode of Cybernation for 2021. It's the first TV program about cybersecurity for a government audience. I'm your host, Francis Rose, with the GovernmentMatters Thought Leadership Network. Cloud capabilities have been part of the government's information technology arsenal for over a decade now. On this program, you'll hear how organizations are moving to multi-cloud and hybrid cloud systems and what IT leaders are doing to securely undergo this transformation. Joining me first, Gary Wang, former Deputy Chief Information Officer at the Army, and David Wray, Chief Technology Officer at Micro Focus Government Solutions. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. Gary, I want to start with you. The Army has been a big mover, a forward leaner on cloud. What are some of the ways that you establish priorities for cloud computing, and what would you advise other organizations to do who are thinking about cloud transformations, how to prioritize and how to systemize?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I think the Army, just by the sheer size, oftentimes you have to take a little bit harder look on what you want to think about in terms of approaching the cloud migration. Funny enough, most of the challenges are not necessarily technical. They tend to be at the enterprise level. Number one, gaining leadership buy-in. That was, I think, very critical during my time as the Army Deputy CIO, and having most of the functional leaders get behind it. I would say probably the second thing is really when you have the strong kind of functional pieces of the Army, whether it's logistics or training or some of the technical kind of weapon systems, all of them, that leadership in there also has to kind of fall behind. The other thing that was nice was getting into a regular drumbeat. I think if you meet regularly in a drumbeat, we had a regular drumbeat. We also had transparency and metrics in place, so to show progress. So those are kind of the maybe non-technical challenges. I would say that one of the complexities that we still deal with today is what happens in a cybersecurity kind of environment. If there's a breach or there's a vulnerability, you kind of have three pieces in this cloud environment. Is, you know, what's the role of the cloud service provider in the environment, and then what's the role of the owner of the application that's using the cloud service, and then in the case of the DoD and the military, we have really the authorities on the network who will be involved. And so that's probably an area of complexity that we probably have not exercised as much as we could. Before, you know, in addition to some of these challenges, I would like to say if you jumped a little bit to the left, it really is more of a concern in terms of cloud preparation. So most people do not take the time to do the preparatory kind of work. And in the case for what we've seen, or at least what I observed, is really having a good assessment up front and making sure, are you prepared or are you ready? So there's the enterprise assessment, and then there's probably then the next assessment is actually the migration of the application itself, and is it the right one? So I would say those are probably the biggest things, but really up front, prior to cloud migration, the assessment. And then the other major observation, in addition to the assessment, is some of the organizations kind of jump to the exotic answer right away. And what I observed, or what we observed, is necessarily that's not the best way to go, but to take a much lower risk approach. And some of the more simple things that you might think are mundane or boring, but actually are lower risk and have greater savings. And I think my counterpart, David, can speak to the last two kind of preparatory steps and the actual lower risk kind of more mundane actions you can take prior to jumping to the sexier things like software factories.
I think that'd be great. David, before we even get to that, maybe step back one step before that and talk about that risk assessment and the components of that, the complexity of a particular application, or the desirability of the outcome, or the age of it and the fragility of a particular application? Maybe it's something that can't break, and it's really old. It's not necessarily super sexy or super high level, high profile. I imagine that risk assessment is maybe one of the most, if not the most important parts of these transitions.
Well, first, Francis, thanks for having me on the show. And you're absolutely right. The risk assessment is critical for success, especially if you're taking a mission critical application and then applying that assessment results to make a decision on how you're going to either rehost or refactor or even rewrite or replace. Most of the federal agencies have already listed many of their high value assets, and most of those are these big, complex, risky legacy applications. And based on the experience that we've had, we typically get involved after they've failed with a rewrite attempt or a refactoring attempt, when they should have taken a little more time on the assessment and looked at the total cost of ownership of putting that application in the cloud with perhaps a rehost offering, which is something we've been doing successfully for almost 20 years now, to be honest. And we've moved some of the largest mainframe and legacy applications to be compiled in Linux and machine code in the cloud. And it opens up a whole lot of shared services that agencies currently have for managing, cloud applications, and you can retire a lot of the process and infrastructure and legacy costs, for the mainframe. So quite often when you do that assessment piece up front, you'll see an ROI sometimes 90% or 95%, like we've seen within some federal agencies, in less than 12 to 14 months. And when you compare that with a rewrite or a risky, refactoring project, usually you can't quantify that amount of savings, because it involves keeping the original application running, for some period of time. So that's been based on our experience, but you do need the right tools for that. Understanding legacy applications, requires a unique skill set, which is different than n-tiered applications or simple commodity applications that you may want to move to cloud. A lot of agencies use the GSA playbook for application rationalization. However, in this case, I really think the government needs a center of excellence to be established. Maybe within GSA's technology transformation group would be a good place for that, to help guide agencies on how to make sure that they're doing the right assessment on the legacy applications and they're doing it correctly, because it is rinse and repeat once you're using the right tools.
Just real briefly, because there are a couple of other things I want to cover, David, but take me to those conversations when you're coming in to triage one of those kinds of transitions that didn't work for somebody else. Are there common themes among the things that went wrong, or is each one unique and different?
Well, with the legacy applications, there's definitely some common themes. Usually what's happened is there's a large set of priorities, especially with COVID and the escalation. They're trying to make these applications scale better and handle more citizen services, especially with our SLED customers. But what ends up happening is they ignore a lot of the assessments, and they rush to get started, and they begin either rewriting or trying to refactor the application because their talent pool is the younger DevOps development teams. And so that's one of the mistakes that they make. They really need to perform that assessment and then figure out the right disposition for those apps first. And it's usually around the other mistakes they usually make is around storage, around not understanding the processes, any customization that was done to the application performance. A lot of the legacy apps that you've got routines in assembly and other tools, and a lot of that can be leveraged with modern services once it's in the cloud. And there's no reason to try and rewrite those. So at times we'll see people making that mistake. So hopefully that answers your questions.
That's helpful, because and that's exactly what I was getting at, are these situations where organizations are making similar mistakes or the same mistakes and doing it differently each different time, and can those be avoided? Gary, we have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to go back to your comment about the three pieces of security. Security, obviously, very top of mind to everybody about everything when it comes to IT and government now. Among those three organizations that are thinking about security or tasked with security, how is that shifting, if at all, as people think more about the different models of cloud computing, on-premises versus off-prem versus a hybrid model? Is that mix of those three organizations and the way they think about security changing?
I think initially, early on, just the physical location had an influence on the type of security in terms of best practices that were being used. So, things initially when data centers were on-prem, it was highly influenced by the organization that had the on-prem data center or the cloud. Since that time, with the connectivity between edge devices and getting in, like what you mentioned, hybrid architectures, there's been kind of a maybe a more balancing of the cybersecurity actions that would be taken in terms of a situation. So that has been helpful, I think, from a large-scale enterprise cybersecurity set of practices and how it can be pushed down to the edge devices very quickly and rapidly. You might have heard of things like endpoint management and endpoint security. I think that's been a tremendous help. The complexity really is the CSP provider and what portions of the cybersecurity actions they take versus when there's a military kind of environment, when we talk about NIPR or SIPRNet, or the networks on the DoD side of the house, and what is the role of the authorities that are responsible or accountable. So that's where maybe it gets a little bit more complex versus a commercial environment. The other thing is, for the longest time now, we recently have been just looking at the upper half of the stack. So you'll hear about cybersecurity relative to just identity management or applications that have security. But what has been a little bit more under the radar and has come to the forefront are things at the firmware level and security there. And I think that's where the cloud providers and some of the other OEM manufacturers will take a harder look at the vulnerabilities at the firmware level. And that's something that's kind of coming to the forefront in regarding the cloud environment.
David, what in the conversations that you've had with government people has been the thing that they've needed to hear the most as far as making these transitions? Where do agencies traditionally have ideas in their heads already that you have to kind of talk them out of?
Yes, and I think thought leadership is really important, especially around having a digital transformation plan. Most agencies have very poor transformation plans for the new digital economy that exists today. Enterprise architecture in the fee adds very little value for transformation to a digital economy and the cloud. And most of the agencies are approaching it program by program and project by project, and they need a stronger set of guideposts and guide rails to guide them. And I usually reference the IT Open Group Open Standard for Digital Transformation, which is IT for IT, and get them started in mapping out a true transformation plan that it provides quantitative and qualitative metrics and has some guideposts so the programs don't reinvent the wheel often, and you can actually establish shared services, a digital software factory, and have enterprise services for DevOps, for software assurance and testing. Those things should be enterprise services, not reinvented over and over again by each team. And it's a very different approach. Most of the, especially within DoD and the Army, they're creating lots of software factories over and over again based on a model, on a framework they've created. But still, the processes aren't set up to be enterprise-based for development, testing, and some of the dev tools.
David Wray, Gary Wang, a ton more I'd like to talk about, but we're out of time. Thanks very much for joining me today. Up next, how an extended period of remote work has been the catalyst for a lot of cloud migration. You're watching the Government Matters Thought Leadership Network. I'll be back right after this.
Cybernation Cloud Migration is brought to you in part by MFGS Inc. and Micro Focus Government Solutions. Learn more at mfgsinc.com. Cybernation Cloud Migration is brought to you in part by Hitachi Vantara Federal. Learn more at hitachivantara.federal.com.
Welcome back. You're watching Cybernation Cloud Migration. I'm your host, Francis Rose. As you just heard, moving from legacy systems to a hybrid cloud infrastructure is no small task. My next guests tell you more on how to do it and the benefits it enables. Dave Peters is Associate Chief Information Officer for the Digital Infrastructure Services Center at the Department of Agriculture. Gary Hicks is Chief Technology Officer at Hitachi Vantara Federal. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for coming on. Dave, you first. The Department of Agriculture has been on this journey for a long time, going into the Centers of Excellence program at GSA as the flagship agency. What element of cloud transitions did that incorporate? Where did you stake your claim to making transitions from legacy applications in data centers to cloud migrations?
So the COE program established a very strong foundation. It provided special forces staff augmentation to a strategy that Gary had really started building off of the USDA strategic plan. And then the COEs really enabled process, enabled greater understanding, established partnership with the mission area CIOs, built a cloud-based contact center, built a cloud-based enterprise data management tool, and a cloud-based voice of the customer tool as well. Today, USDA has in the post-COE environment, has taken that to a much higher level. Cloud migration, cloud adoption is happening effectively and efficiently in the mission areas every single day, where the mission areas are building cloud applications, they're partnering with industry, and they're leveraging that COE foundation to really make a difference. And they're doing it in a smart way that's consistent with the app rationalization strategy by the CIO Council, and also the Cloud Smart approach.
What building blocks did you have to lay to be able to get to that state, to be different in the way that you just described, that you're different than when you started that journey?
You know, I think it was just growing into the process. Sometimes when you have a new technology and you transition from introductory to growth, the scale changes. There needs to be an organizational understanding that needs to change. And I think that happened tremendously across USDA. Gary really set the foundation with his CIO strategic plan, which built off the USDA strategic plan. And then the mission area ACIOs developed their own, which met the needs and specific business objectives of their mission areas. It was very business driven. And once you had that strong foundation, it grew quickly and very organically across the USDA enterprise.
Gary Washington, the Chief Information Officer at USDA, is the Gary that Dave is referring to. Gary Hicks of Hitachi Vantara, welcome to the program. What are you seeing across government, the agencies that are doing this well? What are they doing that's either similar to or maybe different than what you just heard was the path at USDA?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Francis. I was concerned that I'd done a lot of work that I didn't realize I'd done there for a minute. So now I think what USDA has done is kind of different because they actually took a very formulaic and structured approach to moving to the cloud. It wasn't this kind of, and I think Cloud Smart has enabled that for a lot of our customers where, everyone thinks, well, I need to go to the cloud. Well, everything needs to go to the cloud right now, right away. But they took a very structured approach to understand okay, what makes sense to go to the cloud? What can we lift and ship? What do we need to refactor to take the best advantage of the cloud technologies that are out there, the elasticity, the dynamic nature of it, and taking that structured approach builds that governance and that policy and process in place to really, I think, do it very well in a very mature fashion. That's not to say that others haven't taken that approach, but I think people, kind of 9 years into cloud, they're starting to look at it with that critical eye of, let me be a little more structured with the way I move to the cloud.
Since so many organizations, Gary, are trying to do these same things, you talked about the fact that the USDA migration was, you said, formulaic and structured, and I like both those words. The other one that came to my mind was strategic. And I wonder if it's more important that an organization follows a particular strategy or formula, or just that they follow whatever one they arrive at as what they deem to be appropriate for their organization, Gary.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very observant observation, because I think there's no one size fits all. So I think the size of the agency really dictates it. When you have somebody like, DISC, USDA, or DISA, where they're a large service provider, it's a different scale and a different approach. So I think you're absolutely right in that identifying, this is my plan, this is the right plan for my organization, this is what I'm going to stick to, and let's go execute on it. I think that's an important piece of it, is having that formulaic plan, regardless of your size. And there's difference of complexity in all those areas, but actually, having that plan and executing against it, as opposed to just we're going to the cloud. Everyone in the truck, we're leaving now. So
the security implications of this are obviously immense, Dave. Everybody's thinking about security. How does that fit into a transition? And I'm talking about something that you're undertaking now in the post-COE environment, 2021 and moving forward. How do you incorporate security into what you're doing so you're not going after the fact and going, by the way, we also need to nail this down?
That's a great question, Francis. And security is part of the process. My organization has really changed as part of that, going through the COE process and post-COE process. We have a huge hosting division, but as folks go to the cloud, they're making strategic decisions as far as what to keep there and what to move to the cloud and what to integrate between the two, which is also a common outcome. I talk every day with our CISO, Venus Goodwine, and her staff. I talk every day with our CDO, Ted Kaut. And that's really what the DISC organization brings to USDA. The mission areas are picking the applications on a daily, quarterly, and annual basis as far as what they want to move. And they leverage that, what was referred to as structured and formulaic foundation that we built to enable it. So they're leveraging the CISO standards, they're leveraging enterprise data standards, they're leveraging the enterprise architecture, and then they're leveraging what we've developed and implemented in terms of procurement, so they can buy it quicker, easier, faster, and more compliant, and of course, more secure through the approaches that we've developed and implemented.
Dave, are those assessments changing over time, or do you still assess applications for potential transitions the way that you did at the beginning?
It's actually very different. The assessments are generally done by the mission area ACIOs. They own the application, they own the business relationships, and they're using that foundation. They're using that foundation of services that we have. They make the decisions. I was really intrigued when Gary from Hitachi mentioned about formulaic and structured, because if you look across the USDA enterprise and you think about the strategies that the mission area ACIOs have put in place, it's really one size fits one. While they're all using a common foundation, their strategic plans for cloud migration really reflect their each individual business needs, their resources, their size, and the nature of the application itself. So, some are much more quicker to move to the cloud. Others, which, there's still a lot of room for mainframe type applications when you've got high volume, transactional, predictable volumes. And so those, it's really application specific, it's mission area specific. And there's a lot of difference between the strategic plans, but they all leverage that foundation.
Dave, we're starting to run out of time, and I want to give Gary a chance to weigh in on the benefits that I'm about to ask you about. But I imagine that the fact that you had a jump start on this compared to some other organizations really paid off when everybody switched a year or so ago to a remote work environment. What are some of the benefits that you think that you gained as a result of already being on this path?
The cloud migration, really, there were a lot of different dimensions of that, which enabled us to nimbly respond and not lose a beat when the pandemic struck. We had a strong mobile program in place via John Donovan's group. We had our CEC brethren had implemented many work production tools, SharePoint and others, which enabled cloud access to critical applications, data, documents. And so where the work was done really didn't matter. USDA reacted nimbly and didn't lose a beat.
I think, Gary, that everybody within earshot of this program is hoping against all hope that we never experience anything like this pandemic again. But it strikes me that the benefits that Dave just described there are another terrific argument for rationalizing these applications and moving them in whatever the most whatever the most efficient way is of doing so. What have you seen in the way of agencies deciding to think differently about how they're doing it as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think what they've realized is the return to in the office every day. I don't ever work remotely, maybe telework one day a week. I think you're going to see that kind of change because people have demonstrated that they can work remotely, and the cloud platforms, where they didn't have to go through a VPN and concentrator or things of that nature, have really evidenced that. So I think what they're going to do is look at those work styles and use cases that people are using in their day-to-day work, and which of those platforms does it make sense to move to cloud in case this ever happens again, while not also offering a resilient application platform that helps them do their job better, whether they're in the office or remote. I think you're going to see a fundamental change in the way that we work in the federal government space as it relates to that, because I think that's another element or another metric that you can look at is how does this improve my business operations in a pandemic state?
In the time that we have left, Gary, what are benefits, if any, that you have seen that maybe we don't know about yet? We're a year into this pandemic, but maybe we're only a year into this pandemic, and we're certainly only a year into a different way of doing business, a different way of meeting the mission needs of the citizens. Do you foresee anything on the horizon that these cloud transitions, these application transitions will enable that maybe we're not maximizing the potential of yet?
I think the biggest area that we're going to see is the agility of the government to react to, because it is in the cloud, it's an elastic environment. We already have applications that we, in many cases, have refactored to take advantage of that burst capability. I think you're going to see that the federal government is going to become more agile and nimble and be able to scale up. Think of if you think about tax season, the IRS or somebody being able to scale up their capacity in April, from January to May 15th, and then scale that capacity back down as necessary. I think that's one of the primary benefits of cloud, as opposed to, hey, I got to go procure another 100 servers, another 100 terabytes of storage, whatever it may be. I think it allows that elasticity and that agility that our citizens want and deserve. So,
Dave, we have about 30 seconds left. Do you see any potential benefits over the horizon that the government hasn't maximized yet?
I think you'll see the continuation of, folks have been waiting for the new normal. I think, as Gary said, the new normal is already taking root. And I think you'll continue to see success build on success, as things like cloud orchestration take place, which will allow the reuse of code and the reuse of and building on prior successes.
Dave Peters, Gary Hicks, a terrific conversation. Thanks, gentlemen. And thank you for watching Cybernation Cloud Migration, sponsored by Hitachi Vantara Federal and MFGS Inc., master supplier for Micro Focus software. You can track more trends at govmatters.tv/cybernation and w2comm.com. For the Government Matters Thought Leadership Network, I'm Francis Rose.